So when going from Borderlands 3 to Borderlands 4, I think one of the biggest issues that needs addressed is the drop rate of legendary or higher rarity items. And I say higher rarity because we don't know if Borderlands 4 is going to have a rarity above legendaries. Hopefully there is, but if there is, hopefully those higher rarities also follow what I'm going to be going over in this video. Now, when we go look at Borderlands 3, I think it's very safe to say that too many legendary items drop in Borderlands 3. Not only just as baseline drops without any augments, but then all of the ways that you could augment even further drops, whether it be through difficulties or through different items that give you increased chance for drops or specifically increased chance for more legendary drops. There's just too many legendary items dropping. Now, I think there's actually a few different reasons as to why this is the case, and I don't think it's as bad as some people would originally think. And I think the first and biggest issues is anointments. And I think how anointments worked in Borderlands 3 was one of the biggest causes of needing a lot more legendary drops as a whole. Because in Borderlands 3, anointments were basically just augments you can get on any legendary item in the game. And anointments were so strong that a base legendary item without an anointment compared to one with an anointment was a night and day difference, meaning any non-anointment legendary item was basically useless. When you could get an anointment on a legendary and potentially increase the damage of that weapon or some other effect by hundreds of percent, that just means base legendaries were completely useless, meaning even though you're getting a bunch of legendary items, most of them are useless, basically meaning they're not even legendaries. The only reason they're still kind of considered legendaries is because they could have an anointment on them, actually making them useful. And even though this is the case, I still think legendaries should be a substantially lower drop rate, because just having that rarity with that different beam, with the icon on the minimap, is a very different thing, even though those base unanointed legendaries are basically a different rarity as a whole. They're so much weaker than anointment legendaries that they legitimately play the role as a different legendary because they're just so weak. They're still the same weapons, but their power is so heavily reduced that they just basically are a different rarity. So I do think that anointments play a very big role in having way too many legendary drops in Borderlands 3. So I think one of the best things they could legitimately do for Borderlands 4 is whatever the new augment is going to be on different items, which it seems like there is going to be one, is that hopefully it is not so strong that base legendaries aren't useful anymore. On top of that, hopefully these new augments are actually really interesting. Hopefully they're a bit more of like a side grade or a change in how a weapon works or how an ability works, instead of just being hundreds of percent of base damage increase or something, making them very boring but way too strong to not use. So that's the first thing they could do with Borderlands 4 legendary drops or high rarity drops. Make sure those different augments aren't that strong of a difference, so base legendaries are actually useful, meaning they can make it so legendaries drop significantly less than they do in Borderlands 3 because of the fact that base legendaries are actually going to be useful again. And even looking past that, I think legendaries as a whole should be nowhere close to the drop rate they have in Borderlands 3. And if you go and just take a look at the differences between how often legendaries drop in Borderlands 2 to 3, you'll see that they are just multitudes of difference. And Borderlands 2, even though maybe it was a bit low in some areas, I think people fondly look back at that because you actually had a gear chase to getting those items in Borderlands 2 compared to 3. Because one of the biggest issues with things dropping so much is that you kind of remove the chase. You're basically just killing things. Legendaries are dropping everywhere, and you're spending a ridiculous amount of time looking through all of them to find the actual ones that are good or that you want, instead of having them be a more rare drop, and anytime you get one, it feels good, and it feels like you have things to actually go chase. And I do think this is something that's kind of hard to balance when you factor in all of the different elements. Like you have dedicated drops from bosses or different pieces of content. You have random world drops. You have all these different ways to actually go about getting legendaries that it is a hard thing to balance. So I'm not saying by any means that it's easy to get legendary drops in a good place to where they're still rare enough to feel like they have a chase, but they're not too rare. So it feels like you can never get them. And people who don't have as much time to play feels like they could just never get them at all. I do think it should be substantially less than Borderlands 3 as a whole, and I hope that is the case with Borderlands 4. And on top of all of that, not having a rarity above legendary makes any of these options a little bit worse. Because if you have a rarity above legendary and legendaries drop a lot like they did in Borderlands 3, it's actually not as big of an issue as it would have been, because if you get a bunch of legendary drops, but there's still a rarity above it, you don't feel like the highest tier of thing you could possibly get is dropping like candy anymore. It's just meaning that legendaries are a bit of a lower rarity. They're still important, but not as important. But if you massively reduce a legendary drop rate and you don't have a rarity above legendary, it feels like you're just not getting a lot of legendaries, and it feels like you're farming way too much to get to that final stage, with that final stage having a lot less room comparative to the rest of the rarities. If you had a rarity or more rarities above legendary, you can have them be more rare. It just makes it easier to balance those drop rates with the knowledge that there are still things above it. And my personal want for this overarching system would be that in Borderlands 4, there's hopefully at least one rarity above legendary. I would say it should be pearlescent if there's only one rarity above it. Make that rarity above legendary super rare. Maybe make it so it's target farmable, or at least some of them you can target farm something specific. Still make them super rare, but at least allow you to target farm certain things so you can kind of hone in on trying to go for one you want, instead of having this super rare drop be completely random. Then you would have below that, you would have legendary items and whatever the legendary augment items would be. I would want the base legendaries to be quite a bit more rare than Borderlands 3, but not as rare as something like Borderlands 2 items, which were generally maybe a bit too rare, especially world drops. So legendaries would be a bit more frequent than Borderlands 2, but a lot less than Borderlands 3. And then the augmented legendaries should be a lot more rare than normal legendaries. And the reason I say that is I definitely don't want these augmented legendaries to be like Anointments. If they were like Anointments, you want them to drop in a similar amount to normal legendaries because they're just too strong. Base legendaries would be useless again. My hope is that these augments are much less of a just pure power increase, but are more adding some type of maybe horizontal upgrade or some amount of utility or something that's just more interesting than a base power upgrade. It could even be something like changing the element of a legendary. Maybe this legendary only has one element. Maybe you could get a augmented version that has a different element, and that would be like its anointment role, meaning that could be much more rare than normal legendary. So it basically work. You'd have legendary as a rarity. Above that, you would have these augmented legendaries, and then above that, you would have pearlescent. All of those would be more rare than Borderlands 3 legendaries. They would obviously be a lot more interesting, and you would have these different tier of items that allow you to keep chasing higher and higher without feeling like you're just getting them from every single kill. And then obviously you would probably have different ways to increase the drop rates of these based upon the different difficulties you're going through. Maybe some items could increase the drop rate as well. Hopefully not as much as some of the items of Borderlands 3, but I do think that's also a good thing. I don't think you should be getting a lot of legendaries going through like a lot of the earlier points of the game. Like if you're going through earlier points of the game, like you're level 20 and you get one legendary, that should just be a super rare occurrence and should feel amazing, because now it feels like, oh, this playthrough I'm gonna be super strong because I have this legendary, and it should be really strong at those low levels. You should not be getting a lot of legendary drops at those lower levels. Once you start to get into maybe more of the mid game, maybe you'll start to rarely get a drop here and there, and then once you get into the end game, you get to the actual normal drop rates. It can be increased by difficulty. But that's just my general thoughts on how rarity should be going into Borderlands 4, and I'm just hoping they're not super common like Borderlands 3. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.